Hello, today we'll be talking with Curtis Ogden about why his work in building healthy human networks is so essential to the next stage of civilization. Nothing small here.
Wow.
Okay, Curtis is a senior associate with the Interaction Institute for Social Change. IISC is a consulting practice that builds the capacity of organizations and communities and networks to engage in more effective, equitable, and inclusive social change. His work centers on supporting collaborative network development at the national, regional, state, and local levels around a number of issues from food insecurities and health inequity to environmental conservation and economic decline and stagnation. So welcome to the podcast, Curtis. I'm actually very excited about talking to you because you're very much of a hands-on person, right? You actually work with real people.
With real people, yeah, I actually do. Yes, and very much appreciate, as you and I have discussed, bridging what can sometimes feel like the divide between the research, academic side of things, and the practice. So delighted to have this conversation with you.
Great. So first, I mean, a lot of your work involves helping multi-stakeholder networks change their patterns of behavior. Do you have sort of like a template or a plan when you go in, or how does that work?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say that there is a sketch of an approach that we bring in, and then we have to be open to altering that because there's no single network or collaborative that is necessarily the same as another. Context matters, as you know, culture matters. And so you have to sort of honor the individual and essential nature of each one of these change efforts, whether it is emanating from an organization or a community or already as a network, sort of self-acknowledged as a network. That said, we bring in a tool that's called the Framework for Change, where we begin to help whatever the core is of that change effort to identify where it is, where it wants to go, and some thoughts about how it might move forward together, while also establishing an appreciation for the context. So the Framework for Change is an actual tool that we use, a framework that can be filled out. And then we create a pathway to change. So it's really creating a process map of how we move from where we are now to where we'd like to be. And it is very much like this metaphor. This has been up for me for the last couple of weeks, and I can't remember the name of the novelist who said it, but said that he would write a novel much like you would drive a car with its headlights on in a fog. That is, you can see just far enough in front of you to keep moving forward, and you can make the whole trip that way. And so we have an idea about our destination and how we're going to move forward. But given these times that we live in, characterized by uncertainty and volatility, we have to be open to change. And then the other part of it is that we create a structure that has certain roles. Now, those may already exist within that organization or community or network, but we create these teams and ensure also that they're individuals fulfilling roles such as weaving and convening and curation and design and facilitation. And again, whether all those roles are in place to the same degree depends on where that change initiative is.
So basically, when you're doing this network facilitation, you're actually looking for capacities within the organization already and then trying to link them up together in a more functional way. Is that?
Exactly. So it's looking, certainly wanting to honor what already exists, not remake the wheel. Of course, there's some cases where redundancy of function can be really helpful, as you know. But we really want to get a sense of the system. We liken it to, going in and understanding what's already holding the soil together, so to speak. And then, strengthening that. So whether that means some people are fulfilling those roles, but don't have language for it. And so giving some language and also some validation and appreciation for those roles that they play. But then also strengthening. So that may be through capacity building, actual skill building, or again, creating those capacities where they don't already exist.
So in general, you say you have an aim in general that you're going to have to find your way through the fog on. What is the general aim that you're going for, or the target?
Well, I would say that across all of these projects and initiatives, we're trying to create a regenerative society. And those are my words, not always the words of the clients or the partners in this work. But people generally recognize that what we have as dominant systems are taking us down the wrong road. They are inequitable, they are not sustainable, and as you point out in your work, they tend to support, at least in the West, oligarchic, extractive cultures that benefit the few at the expense of the many, and then really everybody, given what we're doing to the planet and place and our ecosystems that support us. That said, these different initiatives may come at that from different angles, and so this network that I've been a part of for 10 years now, Food Solutions New England, has had food systems as its main view. Now that's massive when you think about a food system, but they've also always understood that links intimately with economic development. It links with transportation. It certainly links with care of ecosystems and conservation. It links intimately with dynamics of injustice around race and class and gender. So it's hard to go at all of that initially, but the entry point really has been through food systems and naming a specific vision in this particular case that aligns with that broader picture of regeneration.
So if you name it, what is the name of that vision then? Is it regenerative economics or regenerative or something else?
You mean the broader vision or with that specific?
Well, either way, or both, rather.
Well, so to take food systems, for example, with Food Solutions New England, that vision is really that we are creating, we're evolving to the point where we have local, regional food systems that are drivers for racial equity, thriving communities, thriving economies. And then, feels like I'm forgetting something. Oh, democracy, more democratic ownership and operation of food systems. You could fill in, economics, you could fill in, conservation work with those same kind of qualities. That is, again, equitable, fundamentally sustainable, supportive of long-term prosperity and democracy. So I would say that those are characterizing a lot of the initiatives that I and we are supporting.
Okay. And so you also, you wrote a nice little blog that cites me a lot, so I'm going to mention that. But you talk about that there's a need to view the broader flows that impact your local system as so it's not just you in a little region or where you've got a cultural or a group that you can work with, but it's also the other economic flows and communication flows and all these other kinds of things. So could you say more about how you work with those kinds of things, money, information, resources, energy?
Yeah, sure. So I would say two things to that. So again, using Food Solutions New England as an example, and given I've been working with that for about 10 years, so it's kind of an extraordinary opportunity to be immersed in something for a long haul. Relatively speaking, 10 years really isn't even generational at this point, but 10 years is still 10 years. So two things. We were very clear that when we launched Food Solutions New England that it was going to be a network. And why a network? Because we needed to shore up trust and connectivity across the 6 New England states, across various sectors, across generations, race, gender, all of these things. Because without that attending trust, it was going to be hard to get to any kind of meaningful systemic understanding if people aren't even really talking to each other and sharing information, much less coming to some agreement on what are some areas of systemic leverage or where we could exert effort to kind of move the system in the direction that we want it to move. Now, beyond connections, that means really paying attention to the flows in the region. So where is energy moving? Where is knowledge moving? Where is power moving? How is money moving? So much that we could put under that heading of energy. So certainly when we did a system mapping process, which was a causal loop diagramming effort, we began to get a sense of what is connected, but also what's moving, what's flowing, and what isn't. And what we realized, for example, is that there are certain narratives that are moving in our region around food that don't really align with our destination. A lot of people don't understand food as a system. A lot of people don't understand the history of our food system. A lot of people don't understand the peril we're heading towards because of our extractive practices and the consolidation of the food system. So we needed to get information moving. We needed to get a new food story out there. We needed to help people understand that they are not helpless, right? So everybody can vote with their forks. They can vote with how they spend their money. And the like. So that's an example of how we really began to attune to more of what was moving or not moving, from whom to whom in the region. And we're getting more and more aware of course, the very vested, powerful interests in the food system, especially now, post-pandemic, where, well, not post, but post maybe acute part of the pandemic, where there is a rush now to buy up farmland by some pretty powerful invested interests. And there's also a rush to define what the future of the food system, the dominant food system, is going to look like. And so that's very technologically steeped. Not that the technology itself is bad, but doesn't make room for diverse ownership, doesn't make room for diverse views of what that food system should be, aligned with different cultures within our region or our country or the world. So there's a lot about power that we really need to analyze and really work to shift the flows of power and influence.
Wow. I mean, I think the whole power issue, which is sort of central to our times. And so can you say anything more? Because this is a very interesting topic for me.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot to be said about that. I mean, we begin with an understanding that power is not good or bad. It's, the ability to influence and shape, and it can be used for good or for ill. And of course, that depends on who's defining the good or the ill.
Yeah.
We're aware that power in the dominant food system has been consolidating around fewer, as you know, companies and corporations who essentially own the means of production. We know that, power was exerted just when the initial, European immigrants came to this country and began to take land from the indigenous peoples and suppress their foodways. We know that the system of slavery in this country also had a lot to say about power and how that it was exerted to oppress and force labor for which no reparations have been made, right? I mean, this country was essentially built with slave labor, and some would argue it still is, given how we treat, so-called essential workers, people who work in processing plants, people who are in the fields, farm workers, right? All of those invisibilized workers who have really not had their work recognized. There's a lot to be said about power, and it's not just purely about democratizing power for the people, because we have to recognize that the people is very diverse, and within that, there essentially is a caste system, right? Which Isabel Wilkerson has lifted up very beautifully and excruciatingly, if that's a word, through her recent book, Caste. We essentially have that here, right? And so how can we move forward toward this regenerative future with a caste system? We've really got to grapple with that centrally.
So, I mean, you have a background in education. Isn't education, and particularly empowering education, part of that elimination of the caste system?
I think so, right. And understanding that empowering education can't happen within the dominant form of education we have right now, which is still really oriented towards, feeding people into the industrialized system. It is not necessarily getting young people to question fundamentally, what is being presented to them as systems or options for their livelihood going forward. And of course, that can feel threatening to the dominant order. But until, and it seems like that is, of course, young people are rising up now. It feels like it is a time of reckoning and a call for something truly different. And so it feels like it is, we're in the midst of a real battle here.
Okay, so my current instantation of what we're trying to do for systemic health in societies has these four main pillars. There's resilient structure and regenerative circulation, and the two cultural sides are collaborative learning and common cause culture. So how do you go about building common cause culture in our incredibly fragmented society?
Yeah, I think it is slow work. I mean, again, I will say that with Food Solutions New England, just to give a very clear example, rather than talking in abstractions, a vision was put forward 10 years ago in these 6 states, which upheld this idea that we could become much more self-sufficient in the 6 New England states and determining of our food future. And when that vision was put out at a somewhat diverse, not nearly as diverse as we are now, but a diverse gathering, there was a lot of angst and anger, actually, that got expressed about that vision. I think some existing producers, farmers, were feeling like they were being criticized, and certain, people within the region, I think, were feeling like, well, this is a prescription. Don't tell me how to do my job. So I think that grew out of both a misunderstanding of what the vision was meant to be. It wasn't meant to be a prescription. It was meant to be a for instance, and we can talk about this, and certainly people can take this kind of lofty vision and bring it down to their particular context. But it was clear that we needed to start building trust. And so we built a network team that was very diverse across states and race and gender and generation, and essentially engaged in a year-long learning process to learn from one another, to share stories with one another, to develop more appreciation for what was going on in the region, what was already in play. So both through learning and exchange, we were able to just develop more of a familiarity and again, a trust with one another. And it was from that then that we were able to dive into some deeper conversations about the history of racism, and how if we did not grapple with that, we were going to be moving forward on a vision that was only going to speak to some, really the dominant, meaning white folks and generally the ownership class, despite our saying we needed to, push against that ownership class. So just deepening the learning along the way. And some will say, well, the learning, I mean, we need to take action. And I think there's that kind of false dichotomy between learning and action. In fact, when we came together as a network team, the idea was that learning would go back to everyone's respective homes and places of intervention in the food system and inform their action. And then they would come back together and share. And so it seemed to actually really galvanize people. And it clearly has, because we've been at this for 10 years.
Wow. So, I mean, we've talked about this food network and the New England Food Network before. And one of the things you said was it allows you to kind of develop large scale things that you wouldn't be able to do individually. Mm-hmm. So you can maybe buy in bulk, or you can have lobbying groups, or you can have, common processing centers, or these kinds of things. Does that help build any of the common cause sense of things, or is it within that? Is there still, I want a little bit more, or I deserve more because I'm a particular race or gender, or
Yeah, I think that it's both. It develops both. Well, I would say while we're that idea of common cause and I deserve this are not necessarily mutually exclusive, and this is what
Right.
we're trying to uphold. As we work for equity, that's not the same thing as equality, right? Equality is giving everybody the same, but everybody is not starting from the same point, and
Right.
so Food Solutions New England does uphold this idea that we do need to make reparations to indigenous peoples and the descendants of slaves who've been denied generations of wealth. Now, is it Food Solutions New England work solely to do that? No, we want to advocate for government and federal and state all doing that. And so and we still feel like there's this kind of common cause vision we want to move towards. John Powell, who's at the Haas Center for a Fair and Inclusive Society at University of California, Berkeley, talks about targeted universalism, and I feel like that's what we're really working towards. That is, we have this universally applied set of values and a vision, and the way we get there has to be specifically targeted to where people are beginning. So, it's something that there's so many tensions that we're holding within this network, the collective and then the individual, change and trying to create some sense of constancy, the many working together, and then also allowing for smaller groups to go off and innovate and do what they need to do, hopefully still aligned with that big vision. That's just the dance of working in a network.
It's interesting that you bring up the reparations idea. So for me, there's a language thing. So you also mentioned that you built trust by sharing stories.
Yes.
No, so if I'm a, what is the average farmer in the U.S. is, last I heard it was like 57 years old at least.
Yep. Yep.
So if I'm an old white guy who's, who might want to join this because he might be able to get some benefits like, reduced costs in I don't know, in buying seeds or some such thing. How am I going to feel about also doing reparations for stuff that I may or may not have had anything to do with?
I mean, I guess that depends on the individual. I've definitely met, older white male farmers, right, who are resistant to this idea because they feel like it's either me or doing that. You can't have both. But I was just on a call last Friday with a very diverse group, including an older white farmer who's been at this for decades, and then several younger producers of color, and they were all speaking the same language about this future. And I think they held on to this idea that when you have to choose between two good things, then you're not thinking at high enough of a level. And we really do have to reimagine what's possible. We've been playing the scarcity game for a long time economically. And so we got to break people out of that to help them see that we could have both if we had a fundamentally different paradigm, which you know all about because that's,
Yeah, that's what I write about.
That's exactly right.
But I'm also an engineer, so I care a lot, and part psychologist too. So I care a lot about how do you actually make this happen? I mean, and what your story just then about if you have younger, the old white guy and the younger, people of color who are working in the same field and now have a sense of a common identity, that they are speaking the same language and they do have common interests. I can see how that would work.
Yeah. I think that, of course, there are cases where people are not seeing eye to eye and where people are bringing an either or us them attitude. And I think that frankly is probably what sells more right now in the media than what, to generate that outrage and get us coming back to social media and the news, as opposed to the many examples we are hearing of common humanity. I remember a couple years ago hearing a story out of a southern state where, these conservative white pig farmers came to the aid of black farmers in their community when they heard that they were being treated unfairly. And they brought a real sense of fundamental fairness that allowed them to, sort of take a stand and support their fellow farmers, right? Not black farmers, but just farmers.
Fellow
Right?
farmers, yeah, right.
Saw them, right? You're in the same trade and you're being mistreated, and we can relate to that, obviously not in terms of racism, but in terms of small scale farmers being, edged out, the further consolidation of the system, not fair, right? So there are ways and places for us to find that alignment. It is not easy. Clearly, we're fighting, a lot in terms of, well, again, social media and outrage, and there's a place for that. There's a place for outrage. There's a place for anger. To talk about moving energy. To galvanize for change, and we also have to create these spaces where we can work things out.
See, I think the point about common humanity, I think that's where we need to head. But a lot of that is you have to have personal experience with people who are life experience has trained you to put them in a particular bucket. But until you actually have personal relationships with them and you find out, well, no, they're not like that, or they don't fit that mold.
Yeah.
That's what makes a lot of the difference. And I think, ironically, a lot of the people on both right and left in the mainstream media in particular are because because they make their money by controversy. I think they sort of feed into that, keeping people in their little stereotype bins. Even while even the ones who are progressive, who are thinking that they are making things better, but I don't know, if you don't have some kind of way of keeping it human and seeing these alternative stories, that bringing the common humanity together. That's one of the things that really worries me, because I think it's sort of like the tacit effect of oligarchy, because the media guys are just doing what they have to do to earn their living. Sure.
Well, and there's the longstanding, ploy to use race as a way of dividing up the workers, right? And
exactly, right.
Against one another. Yeah, I mean, it's obviously very complicated. And yes, coming to common humanity, yes, and whose work is that to do first, right? I would argue that, for those of us who have considerable privilege, including myself, in this body, as a male, as a white person, formally educated, cisgendered, straight, I feel like I've got a real role to play here as somebody who has dealt with relatively little, comparatively, trauma and risks to my health and security. So can I, leverage my regulated nervous system to create those spaces where I'm willing to take people's anger and understand that is coming from often a place of just deep hurt and trauma. I'm thinking about that more and more, which is not to say that I'm coming in as a savior. But, in that standoff of anger triggering anger and hurt triggering hurt, there's got to be something that breaks that. And so if I can help do that, I want to.
Okay, so I'm going to tell you a counter story, because this is one of the things that I really think about a lot and I don't have a great answer for. But when I was in grad school in psychology, they had a workshop on racial equality. And it was run by a black guy. And it had a bunch of white and black people, men and women. And they were going through and the blacks were telling their stories. And a lot of the blacks were being really violent or verbally violent towards the white people, who most of whom were just, liberal progressives. They weren't really people who were intentionally racist and had probably spent a lot of time trying to be unracist as much as humanly possible. Anyway, and at some point, the facilitator kept allowing this to go on until at some point, one of the other black guys basically stopped one of the other black people who was attacking one of the white people and said, wait a second, it's not their fault. And that's when the instructor broke in and said that's what needs to happen, because one of the things we need to do is get out of the victim mentality, and have it, because part of taking your power is asserting the common humanity for the other person, even though you have a sense of, that they have done you wrong. And so you have a legitimate gripe against these people, against a particular race.
Right.
But these people are not that race. And so it was really very interesting, and once that transaction occurred, once the black guy stopped the other black guy from basically being racist against the white people, it changed everything, and everybody got it. It was very interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, I guess a few things in what you just said. I would say that, one of the things we definitely say is that racism is only applied when it's the dominant group showing oppression to another group. Now,
right.
We would say that, there's this idea that a black person can be racist toward white people who would not support that. I mean, you can be bigoted for sure, but racism is about perpetuating a system of power arrangements. And so it really only flows from white people toward, people of color. Again, they can be judgmental of one another in certain ways, and we would say that that's more bigotry. It's and then in terms of the earlier comments about that class, I mean, I think that there are a few things. I think that one of the things we have learned and teach is that racism is not just about interpersonal racism. It plays out on multiple levels. And so, I'm reminded of the Trayvon Martin case where, the conversation in the media was about whether the jury in that particular case was racist or not racist. And it sort of left this frustratingly very simplistic conversation. So people don't have to be racist overtly for racism to exist. It can exist within institutions. It can.
Oh, absolutely.
Narratives and those kinds of
I think basically it's a result of, the way, if you get exposed to particular ways of thinking when you're growing up, your brain just wires that way. And so you have to work consciously to unwire it.
Sure. And if you're not, then, I can understand how there would be that rage and frustration on the part of other people who say, well, I'm not racist, but then you don't do anything, right? So for so many white people, because they are isolated in white communities, or they can just afford to not do anything and not have it really come back and implicate them, that's the end of the conversation. Well, I'm not racist, so why are you angry? There's actually, I just have to say this conference that was held over the last 3 days out of Middle Church called Revolutionary Love. And it's a beautiful array of speakers. And I think really holding on to this notion that it's not, yes, we need love. Yes, but it can't be love that is blind to history, that is blind to systemic dynamics, and is blind to the individual accountability. Even if one isn't racist individually, are they doing anything to actually change the system? Are they doing things to become aware of their privilege and not continuously playing into that script? And if they aren't, then how does anything change here? So I think it's complex, and even in that Revolutionary Love conference, there were speakers who were basically saying, yeah, rage has a place. Rage has a place because it is about trying to get other people to, well, it's about, exerting your anger, but it's also, I think, trying to get people to wake up, And that's not going to work with everybody, but in some cases it does. Like rage can get people's attention. The demonstrations, you can have all these conversations about whether demonstrations are appropriate or effective. They certainly have gotten more and more people's attention this year. So anyway, I know I'm going on and on, but
No. I don't know if we should keep on this one, but I think I still kind of, I think I'm sort of skeptical about the promotion of the legitimizing the rage as opposed to working on the common humanity. I think, for instance, like with the George Floyd, I think that watching the video of that turned a lot of people because it was so blatant. And in the crowd, there were white people and black people who were both objecting. And they were, and, you know, and some of them were, you know, there was a, you know, so there are different roles in society too. They weren't, it
yeah.
wasn't, you know, okay, so.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess I would just say that I think there's a place for all, like, it all fits, it all belongs. Rage and anger, I think, have been behind every social movement that has actually made change.
Yeah.
Now, it may not be the ultimate, most visible expression, but it's been there. It's had a role. And you know, I'll just, there's this other really provocative quote that came up in this Revolutionary Love convening where just pointing to how, you know, Black rage throughout the history of this country has been viewed as and portrayed as a threat, while white rage has often been uplifted as a sacrament. And you think about what just transpired at the Capitol on January 6th. I mean, could you imagine if those were Black bodies and how?
Oh, absolutely. 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 No, I'm mostly, well, okay. I agree with everything you're saying that, you know, but let's see if it's kind of like, oh, here's another story. All right. So I did some work with time banking with a guy named Edgar Kahn, who was one of the founders of time banking.
Oh, yeah.
And he had a sociologist who was studying one of the main issues that they were having, which was that they had all of these nice liberal people who were giving things, but not taking things.
Hmm.
And it turns out that the key to empowering people is not just getting charity, because charity ends up being a status thing. You have enough in the society that you're able to give to these other people. It has to do with the people who are traditionally as Kahn used to call them, the throwaway people, the elderly and sick and disabled and poorly educated and poor and just Black women, so on and so forth. It's having their gifts received, so that it's their giving that makes them feel empowered. And it doesn't matter what it is that they are doing that is received, but it's a sense that their work has value.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so for me, so they had to require the nice liberal people to start receiving things from the other people. I think that's kind of goes back to my sense of why the workshop I had in grad school was so transformative, was because it was the Black people giving to the white people. It was they were defending them in essence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to speak to that specific instance.
Yeah. Anyway,
I think it's complex, and certainly, you know, it's not monolithic in terms of how people in any kind of race or identity show up around this conversation. So,
well, let's try something else then. Let's try the leadership and okay, so from my point of view, hierarchy is necessary and oligarchy is a dysfunctional form of hierarchy, which is basically, it's a hierarchy we run by and for the people who are on the top.
Right.
And hierarchies are actually designed to do that. We're designed to lock in behind strong leaders. That's kind of hardwired into our brains, and some people are more that way than others. But But in crisis times like we are now, that's exactly when we are likely to lock in behind strong leaders, which is why Trump, one of the reasons why Trump, emerged, was because there was a whole bunch of people who, people who had voted for Obama in the first two elections, but were just, they just weren't getting anything out of it, and their lives were getting worse and worse, and so they were willing to take a chance on somebody who seemed to be a straight shooter and somebody who was clearly strong and not willing to be, was not willing to conform.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're going to get out of this, and one of the things we're going to have to do is figure out how to have leadership that is strong, that exudes strength, but is not just self-serving. Any thoughts about how that works?
Well, I think we're seeing a lot of that now. I think we're seeing a change in terms of who is leading many institutions. I think over the last year, again, I think it's also recognizing that leadership that has existed for a long time, often in places that have been made invisible, not heard. I just what has led to community resilience in those communities that have been oppressed and marginalized. Often it is that very kind of leadership that you're talking about that's strong, but not just making it about oneself. I mean, that's how these communities have long survived. And I think what you're seeing, I mean, I can speak to, my own organization in the form of Kelly Bates, who's a biracial woman who took up the reins of our organization, the way that she leads, and she would be the first to say it's not her alone, but she is, our president, not but, and she is our president, and leads in this way of just bringing a strength around our core commitments to racial equity and also really honoring the collective. And so they don't have to be, and they should not be, and they are not mutually exclusive. But I'm seeing, frankly, I would say it's more women of color showing up in organizations who are able to hold that, in part because I think that's what so many have had to do, just to hold families, communities together. So it's not new, it's always been there, and now it's showing up, I think, more visibly.
Yeah, they're sort of taking it on at a new level in broader organizations, I think.
Yep. Yeah, and it shouldn't be their work to do alone, right? That's the other thing we know, is that it's a dangerous setup, right? Then to say, all right, now we're going to bring in this person, and they're gonna fix us. And of course, we know that women and leaders of color tend to be under much more scrutiny than people who look like me, frankly, who've gotten away with tremendous mediocrity and bad behavior. And so that double standard is a setup. We need to make sure that doesn't lead to further harm.
Okay, I think we're about out of time now. This has been very interesting. I hope I haven't been pushing you too hard.
No, I'm appreciative of where the conversation has gone, for sure.
Okay. Well, take care. And again, thank you so much for participating in all of this.
Thanks, Sally.
All right, take care.